Welcome back to the Disconnected podcast. I'm your host, Jessica, and today I'm here with Dr. Rebekka King. Dr. King is a professor of religious studies at Middle Tennessee State University, the president of the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and she is the advisor for this project. So a very special welcome to you, Dr. King.
Thank you, Jessica.
Absolutely. So to get started, Dr. King, can you tell us about your research and your areas of expertise?
Yeah, sure. I'll quickly tell you about my research, but I think what would actually probably be more helpful for you is if I talk briefly about what we do in the academic study of religion, just to give you listeners a little bit of a sense of, the types of conversations that we're having that will help frame some of my answers to your questions. But my research looks at contemporary Christianity, and I'm interested specifically in how contemporary Christians read the Bible. My doctoral research looked at a group known as Progressive Christianity and their reading of the Bible through the lens of historical biblical criticism. So work being done by scholars, by biblical studies scholars, how that type of work was received or is being received in Christian congregations. So that's my research area. I'm trained broadly as an anthropologist of religion. And one of the great things about teaching at a school like MTSU that is a teaching intensive institution is I get to teach courses on all sorts of topics. So from courses in my area of expertise on Christianity to biblical studies, I teach a course on religion and film. I first encountered you because I was the professor for the honors lecture series, which was themed around the idea of images and icons.
Which was wonderful.
Right.
So
you
good.
have to say that, right?
No, I don't. It was so good.
But I want to talk a little bit about what we do as scholars of religion. Obviously, MTSU is a public institution, and like all public institutions in the United States, studying religion is about looking at how different religious traditions have impacted or do impact society, right? So we are not doing the work of theology. In some ways, theology is much closer to the type of work that my colleagues in philosophy do, right? Theology asks the questions of, is there a God? What does it mean to be a good person? Or what does it mean to be a moral person? How should we interact with divine figures? All of those are the questions that theologians ask. And from the perspective of the study of religion, we are more interested in what people do with those questions. So how do people act based on their moral guidelines, or how do people respond to the existence of God or not? We work really hard to do something that's known as bracketing and to kind of bracket out our own personal faith so that we can, as best as possible, approach our studies from a non-biased or an empirical perspective. So as we're talking today about these great questions that you sent me ahead of time, know that I'm not speaking about my own personal experiences of faith, but rather thinking about how religious theorists think about religion or talk about its impact on the world. So I use a lot of anthropological and sociological theory. I have other colleagues who might be using more philosophical theories, or colleagues coming at it from the perspective of historical criticism or historiography. It really depends on what one's own sort of area is within the discipline of religious studies. And it makes for really rich conversations because religion is a confusing concept and everyone thinks they know what it is. But once you get a bunch of people in a room trying to figure out what religion is, all of a sudden sort of certain arguments emerge. But it's cool, right? Like when I was in graduate school, I can remember sitting across the table from people who were working with ancient Tibetan manuscripts, or people working on, the role of witchcraft in medieval Christian church, and my own work on contemporary Christian Bible reading, right? So there's all of these different topics that come together under this umbrella of religion.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. That sounds like it would be a great conversation.
I think so. Yeah, I'm glad you do too.
Yeah, and I'm excited for this conversation because it sounds like your field of expertise is very fitting. In the past few podcasts that I've done, the beginning of this series, they're more focused on psychology and the building of relationships with other people. So that's very concrete. A lot of the evidence is very tangible and the feedback is almost immediate. But transitioning into talking about religion, a lot of the things that we talk about, the concepts and what we're talking about in this series, relationships with supernatural beings, it's very abstract. And so I wanted to talk about the cognitive basis of religion with you. So from what you've read and the research you've done, what are some of the factors that allow our brains to process and believe in religious concepts?
Yeah, so we're dealing here with an area of study that has emerged somewhat recently. I guess within kind of the last 10, 15 years, there has been this increased interest of thinking about religion and really how religious ideas and concepts are formed through the perspective of cognitive theory, and specifically through the perspective of cognitive evolutionary theories. There's a number of scholars who've been working in this field. I know you've done some readings on Pascal Boyer's work. There's other figures, Ilka Pusianen, Ann Taves, Justin Barrett. There's a number of big figures who've been working on this topic. And it's really compelling. I do want to say that I'm not sure I find it completely convincing, but I don't know what it is I find that is not convincing. But we're going to work with the theory. And in some ways, I think that's the fun of it, right? So I don't necessarily have to believe all the premises or follow all the premises, but that we get to play with it. But from this perspective, there is an argument that our brains have become or have developed in such a way that we are hardwired to accept certain religious ideas. And that this was at one point something that survived in our development, back sort of many, many centuries ago, when we're dealing with kind of humans first sort of emerging and separating as the Neanderthal, et cetera, that the ability to process or imagine some sort of external being became something that was helpful for human survival. And the example that Boyer uses is that if you are out sort of hunting, so imagine we're these hunter-gatherer figures and people are out hunting and they hear a rustling in the bush. It might be nothing, right? It might be the wind. But if somehow you are preconditioned to place some sort of idea that that rustling sound I hear, or that unexplained phenomenon in the bush is an agent, you're more likely to survive because it might be nothing, but it might also be a lion or a bear that jumps out and eats you. So if you're the person who thinks, oh, it's nothing, then you get eaten by the lion. But if you're the person who thinks that might be something, I should act cautiously, then you're going to be more likely to, survive, have children, right? Sort of your genes are going to be passed on.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you say that you don't necessarily subscribe to the theories. I think and I mean, I know you said you don't know exactly why, but do you have an idea why you don't find them completely convincing?
Yeah, I do find them compelling. And I think that's what it is. I'm suspicious of anything that has all of the explanations for us.
Yeah.
But part of what is interesting is the theorists in this field then kind of want to think beyond that. And they're interested in this question of, well, what types of external agents or what we call superhuman agents do people then begin to imagine? And they spend a lot of time thinking about, well, there are certain types of concepts of these external agents that are somehow more than human, that are going to be more cognitively contagious, is the term they use. And so, for example, we often tend to think of these agents as somehow reflecting our own human sense of what it means to be an agent, right? So I am an independent thinking mind. I'm able to sort of process things logically. And so while I might think of a supernatural being like a ghost, for example, as this sort of supernatural being that can walk through walls or be invisible, but I still want it to have some sort of human component to it. So the ghost has a sense of its own identity, or it has a memory, right? The ghost can remember something that's happened to it in the past. And in some ways, it's the more human components of the supernatural that make them more compelling for humans to believe in them or to presume their existence.
Yeah, that's just fascinating because I was going back and rereading, like you're talking about Boye's book, that he was talking about how there has to be something that's similar enough to us that we can understand it. Its mind is like us, or its physical body is like us, something like that.
I think that's what I think is the most interesting about it, is that we have, when we imagine these superhuman beings, or when humans try to think of what something that transcends us would be like, that of course the only categories we have are our own human categories, and so we can only really imagine them as having desires that might be different in kind but are somehow akin to the types of desires that we have. This need to, which I think is part of what your project's about, this need to relate to another is something that we almost universally presume when we think about supernatural beings, right? That they somehow want to interact either with each other or possibly with us.
Yeah. And it reminds me of some of the mythology that I've read before, like Greek mythology. You see these gods and goddesses who are very human-like. In other religions, the being is very, or can be perceived as distant because they're so different from us. But then you have these other religions where the beings, the supernatural beings, are very similar to humans in that they have desires and they can be selfish and angry and lash out at people, but they have that agency. So talking about the separation between humans and these invisible agents, how do we believe in these supernatural beings when there is, or there may be, little to no physical evidence of them?
Yeah, and I think that Boye would say, well, that's because our brains have been hardwired over through an evolutionary process to accept those ideas, or to want to accept those ideas, to have that space, that cognitive space with which to presume that or believe in these invisible agents. I think that there's something very human also, though, about being able to imagine that there is something that is beyond the point of our own capabilities, right? This is what the transcendent is, right? We understand ourselves as limited, and we're limited by a number of factors, including time and space, and ultimately by death, right? We do not live forever. But we can imagine beings that are able to transcend those things. So while we exist in time and moving forward at a certain pace, we could imagine a being that could exist across time, all in all times at once. And that is so much in opposition to our own experience that that's where the power of it lies. Right? We can imagine a being that is able to transcend physical spaces and be everywhere at once. We can imagine a being that does not die, that lives forever, that was never born and therefore never dies. The very limits of our human condition create the potential to imagine something that transcends it.
Yeah. And we definitely have those cognitive capabilities. I was reading a book called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And Dr. Barrett starts at the beginning of the book talking about how brains have evolved in humans. And then by the end of it, she talks about how our brains can create their own reality. And what she talks about is that we create social reality, in that everything we do on a daily basis, from putting value on money and giving it in exchange for something else, or, caring about what other people think and giving authority to governments and allowing them to do certain things and giving power to people. All of these things are examples of social reality, in that there's a difference between natural reality in the mountains and the streams and the plants. And then our social reality is not tangibly real, but it is just as real to us. And we can change the rules in an instant, and that becomes real. So we have this shared reality. And taking it in the frame of this project, that allows us to see things that are not necessarily there, to understand things and imagine things that are beyond our physical reality, which is just amazing to me. That she talks about the way that our brains process information, and that they take in all these cues and they make summaries in a process called compression. So you take in a summary, your neurons summarize that and they send it to the next stage and then they summarize that. So our brains are just summaries of summaries of summaries of information. But that allows us to think abstractly and to think, like we were talking about, beyond what we see in our immediate environment.
That becomes the origins of what makes us human and perhaps what helps distinguish us from the animals, right? That their nature is maybe not one that is able to draw those same types of inferences or to construct these larger social worlds for ourselves, right? And how boring would life be if we didn't have all these things?
That's so true. Yeah, it definitely is something that separates us. And she does go into that, talking about how animals don't necessarily do this. We assign different purposes and different meanings to the things around us that are not naturally there. So, what are some of the reasons why people choose one religion over others, even when they've been exposed to a variety of religions? I mean, I've interviewed some people so far that will come later in this series, but multiple people have been exposed to various religions and then they choose one or they say they get kind of stuck on one. So, why do you think this happens?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure how helpful my answer is going to be, but I think that for so long in human history, of course, the idea that one would choose a different religion is not something that would have made sense, right? There's, for much of human history, people were born into a worldview and accepted that worldview as such. When I talk about this in my classes, I say, the belief in God was very similar to how we think about gravity. It's something that exists, right? I don't spend a lot of time worrying about my relationship with gravity, how gravity feels towards me, or whether gravity is going to be consistently part of my world, right? Just every day I wake up and things are not floating around, and the forces, the scientific forces, the physical forces are just there. And so for a long time, that's, I think, how people thought about religion. It's really not until we get to the modern era and see the democratization of individualism and the idea that everyone is an individual, which emerges during the time of the Enlightenment and comes full force in modernity, that idea that one would pick and choose different parts of their life is really made available to everyone, right? Certainly we can look back and say, we have all of these stories of, the Greek heroes and how they made great choices. But they're heroes. They're not everyday ordinary people. But in our contemporary culture, especially, right? You choose your career. You chose what you were going to study in college. You choose your spouse or your mate or a series of mates for yourself, right? You choose sort of elements of what types of social activities or lifestyle you might embark upon. All of these become choices to us in modernity in a way that they were not in previous times. For much of human history, you'd be born into a particular classification. You might be born as a peasant, and then you would stay a peasant your entire life. So this idea of being able to switch is really new. In terms of religion, which is what you've asked about, the idea of choosing religion or one religion over the other, I think it's still fairly rare, though. I think that people, usually the vast majority of people, maintain the religious identities that they are born into or exposed to from a young age. And that's because that becomes what shapes their world and shapes their cultural norms. And even when we see shifts in religiosity, those shifts aren't necessarily as radical as we might otherwise think that they are. In order to convert to another tradition, it has to be something that's available to you, right? So it's very easy to shift from one variety of Christianity to another, especially if you live in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Absolutely.
Right? Where there are so many churches, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But it's also, fairly easy to, or would be fairly easy to convert to Islam in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, right? Because there is an active Muslim community here. And because while certainly Christians and Muslims would be very quick to point out the differences between their religions, they're not actually that different, right? There's more similarities between them than differences in terms of how one thinks about themselves as a religious agent. I think that people choose one religion over the other, but usually make choices that are already going to fit in with their own existence. And then I think that often we find that the reasons people convert have to do with often sort of very economical reasons, right? It would be good to convert in order to marry someone from a different religion, right? Having to convert in order to, if you've fallen in love, that's a good reason. Certainly, if we look at the colonial context, most of the conversions to Christianity were about gaining access to resources that the missionaries brought with them. So I think usually people convert because it's pragmatic.
Huh. You're right. That wasn't a perspective I was expecting. That we look for a sense of familiarity in religion when we're even in choosing other religions or being exposed to them. I think, like you were talking about, we have a very strong sense of freedom, especially in today's society, but that we're still tied to a lot of things. There's still a lot of very strong influences, especially from family and from our past. And looking for things that are familiar is definitely one of those strong pulls. So, in talking about the differences between, again, people and the way they choose to communicate with other people versus religious beings, what role do religious objects such as icons or written texts or different talismans that people have, what role do they play in the development of people's beliefs? Different people have said that that's not necessarily a necessary component of religion. That's not what their religion hinges on. But things like that, like the icons, pictures, and different things like rosaries or bowing to a statue, especially in the beginning of someone's journey with religion, they rely on a lot of these things. But then some people say that it's not necessary. So I'm looking at it from the aspect of what do we need to be religious? Because most of it is abstract. So do we need some tangible thing that sort of grounds us and anchors us in this religion that we can sort of see and be like, yes, this is something that connects me to that?
I love this question because it's not something that we've talked about previously, but I think it's something that's been drawn to your attention based on the research you've been doing. But the question you're asking is this question of like, what is material religion? How do people perceive certain objects as either objects that enable them to practice their religion, or that the objects themselves have some sort of religious or supernatural significance to them? For so long, we have tied our understanding of what religion is or what religion does to philosophical or abstract ideas, that somehow it's the working out of these big questions about the meaning of life. And certainly within the development of Christianity, which has then shaped the Western world, there has been this overarching suspicion of objects, right? We see these sort of movements of iconoclasm that take their peak form in after the Protestant Reformation and the smashing of Catholic churches, but have always been somewhat present, that there's this human suspicion of the object. And I'm not sure that I can completely understand where it comes from, but then anytime we're suspicious of something, it also ends up often having the opposite effect of making it more powerful or more profound. But religion is complicated, right? Like, we are these meaning-making beings, and that having something physical, something tangible, like you said, to center oneself, it allows us to make these things that are completely outside of the human realm, right, completely supernatural. It gives them some sort of natural ability, right? You can hold on to the object and cling to it in a way that we can't, and in a way that's really terrifying if we really start to try to think about the expanse of the supernatural potential.
That's so true. I think what I'm getting at with these questions is that sort of what do we need for religion to be possible,
Mm.
in a sense? One of the comments that I had written in my notes is that the world's religions, as far as I know, most broadly have been passed down and communicated through storytelling.
Mm.
So there's no real physical aspect to that. It's more of just I have this information and I'm going to give it to you the best way that I can, but it's only recently that we've had printed texts or things like rosaries that you were talking about where we can mass produce them and send them to everyone. In general, throughout most of history, most people do not have these sorts of things. But on the other side, I think there's that idea of people wearing necklaces or holding little statuettes and things that we give things a sacred meaning without necessarily thinking about or without them having to be assigned a meaning by someone else. Sometimes we take those things and give them a meaning.
I think that part of what you're getting at there is this really interesting question of people understand themselves as part of these larger traditions. And that has developed sort of into our modern era so that we have these kind of world religions, but they're so big. So, in order to really engage, and especially in our contemporary era where religion has become this personal and often private experience, people need something personal in order to make it their own religion. And I think you're right that there are these objects that people hold to as having some sort of profound religious symbolism to them. And often they'll be something that is part of the official corpus of the tradition. But I think the reason they're meaningful often has little to do with religion and everything to do with our own lives, right? So the rosary is meaningful because it's the rosary that your mother gave you at your first communion, right? The statue is meaningful because you have purchased it while you were traveling in the Holy Land for the first time, right? These things take on meaning that are about wanting to write our own personal stories into these otherwise large epic tales that come to us from religious traditions.
That's so true. Something in that book, When God Talks Back by T.M. Lerman, she discusses how different ways that people perceive Christianity and that it's just sort of a you choose and then it all just comes naturally and your whole life changes. And sometimes that can be the perspective of religion that people have. But she discusses how, specifically in evangelical Christianity, there's a learning process. You have to make that initial choice to say, I'm going to believe in God, but then you have to change your behaviors after that to sort of reinforce this. And at the beginning, she talks about you pretend that God is real. And then after you pretend for so long, he becomes more real to you. So it's just that sort of religion is personal, but it's not necessarily like an automatic, oh, my whole life and worldview and every perspective that I have changes automatically.
Yeah, and I would recommend that book to any of your listeners who haven't had a chance to read it, because you're right. She spent time with evangelical Christians trying to figure out where that comes from, because from the outside looking in, people think that everything is fixed on that first moment of conversion, of becoming. And I think a lot of Christians would think that too, but that's what she really uncovered, is that this struggle that they took to try to somehow have this relationship with God and to access these supernatural forces in ways that were really about like disciplining their minds. And they don't do it, they don't take any shortcuts. They really have this sense that not only is this process very difficult and uncertain, but that there's an ethic to it.
Yeah. So is believing in these invisible supernatural beings comparable to long distance relationships in that with long distance human relationships, there's still some mechanism for feedback, especially in modern days. We have Zoom or FaceTime. So you get immediate feedback. You can talk to someone across distances, but there's still a separation. A lot of people talk about when they go back home to their parents, oh, I'm going to, reconnect with my parents, because there's just something lacking in that distance that we can't quite bridge, even with the technology that we have today. But in that, if we talk about that and there's just something missing, kind of where does that leave a relationship that someone builds with a supernatural being that they can't see, that they may not get the same immediate feedback from, in terms of, I'm speaking to you, I ask you a question, you respond right back to me. There's that communication and that channel of communication, but that's not necessarily the same. What is the connection that we need? Is it comparable to a long distance relationship in that way because of the distance?
Yeah. The real question that I'm interested in is about the long distance relationships. I'm not interested in the religious component of this question at all. Religion is boring. That's a joke. But
you're like, I'm only dedicating my whole career to it.
Friends don't let friends, right? But why do we maintain long distance relationships? What purpose do they serve? Especially in our modern era where, there's a chance that you may never see the person that you're in a long distance friendship with. Thinking broadly about the types of friendships or relationships we form. And you use the example of parents, and I think that's a really interesting one that is applicable to your own experience as a college student, right? So many of your friends have left home for the first time recently and are thinking about their relationships with their parents in a way that they haven't had to before. And as someone who's a little bit older than you, not significantly or anything,
just a couple years,
but I have left several communities and have friendships or relationships that have come and gone. I think that the appeal of maintaining a friendship over a distance, I think if we're really being honest, it's because there's something about that relationship that reflects a fundamental sense of who we are. And again, your example of parents makes sense, right? When you go home to your parents, they know you in a way that your friends at college don't know you, right? They changed your diapers, and hopefully your friends at college have not had to change any diapers for you.
Oh, I hope not.
Right? And I think there's something to be said when you meet with old friends. There is something about the people who knew you back when that feels really meaningful and important. And we put the effort into maintaining those relationships because there's some sort of service that they provide to us that I think it has something to do with our own sense of self. So is there something in the way that we imagine these supernatural beings as a way or as existing elsewhere that also reflects or responds to that yearning for a version of ourselves that perhaps we are not able to access regularly?
I wouldn't have thought about that, but there is some component of identity in those relationships, and especially with religious relationships. That is an interesting perspective.
There's something about the friendship or the relationship that is being maintained over a distance that we must feel we're not able to get in our immediate context, right? Because otherwise, why would I ever, reach out or talk to, my childhood best friend if I could just have the same type of relationship with one of my colleagues here at MTSU? What would be the point of reaching out to her? But there's something about that friendship, and I think humans are actually incredibly self-centered. And so I think a lot of what it is about how we feel and how that friendship makes us feel and how that friendship tells us something about ourselves and who we are that you're not getting in this other context, in your immediate context. And I think maybe religion is doing that in some way. So it's not the same. It's not about being reunited, but it's about wanting to have that profound experience and the sort of the feelings that come from it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it does. It's a little cynical, but it's
definitely,
it's very
I
appreciate it.
I thought that's what we were doing. That's what it means to be a scholar of religion, right? Or, just a human being in the world these days.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh, yeah.
Although I don't think it's cynical, because I think how beautiful is that we want to know ourselves. We want to know the answer to this question, what does it mean to be human? And we're seeking it out in so many different ways. That's what I always say to students, right? Like, this is why you come to college. This is why you read the great works of literature and the poets from antiquity. This is why you struggle through dense philosophical texts, because there is a very real chance that those texts or those poets or those authors know you better than you know yourself. And isn't that the point of being human, to continue to discover?
Yeah, reaching for something more.
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
I mean, hope is everything, right? That's all we have is hope. But you can only have hope because there is darkness. We can't hide the darkness. We have to let the hope shine through it.
Yeah, look at that. See? You're not too cynical. You're not too jaded.
Right? It's good.
Turned it around here. Brought it back to hope and beauty. That's wonderful. Yeah. I think that coming back to the human condition, that we have all of these things in these religions because of that, because of something in us that is looking for something else.
And I think that's what I do find compelling about any theory of religion, but particularly I think this cognitive theory, is that it allows us to say that the great paradox of religion is that it is really focused on the supernatural, and how do we access it? How should we think about it? How should we, frame ourselves in relationship to it? But it does so through answering this question of, like, what does it mean to be human? And it's so fascinating that religion gives us a way to answer the question, what does it mean to be human, by examining or interacting with something that is not human, that more than human, right?
Right. Something that doesn't have the limitations that we have.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
But we can only frame it through our own human limitations.
Our limitations.
Because that's all we've got. That's why I study religion, because that the tension of that question, I just find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah. Another note that I had made that's sort of related to this and talking about communicating in that way is, what influences does modern technology have on people's connections to religious concepts and or supernatural agents? I'm very curious about what kind of effects this has, because obviously technology has completely changed human life as we know it. So in that same vein, does it change how we view religion? Because like you were saying about the ways that religion has changed for people throughout history, and it's become very personal, it's become just very different from what it was. So has technology had another impact on that?
The greatest technological advancement that humans have ever experienced was the onset of agriculture. And that certainly radically transformed religion. All of a sudden, this capacity to stay put, to be in one place, forced them to invest in spaces in a way that was very different from the ways that hunters and gatherers and nomadic communities had understood space. And all of a sudden, things like fertility became central focus. And how do we distribute food in a way that is going to be well, hopefully equitable and just, but regardless, is a way that's going to reflect their religious traditions and structures. And of course, that's when we see the onset of temples and a priesthood, right? Or some sort of institutional hierarchy that took over religious roles. So we saw religion radically transform. We could say, probably the printing press might be the next big event that happened that changed things. And so now the question is, as we've moved into this information era, and an era that has also been accompanied by nuclear power and the use of fossil fuels, all of these things are currently transforming our world. But I don't know whether we know right now. We may be seeing religion in a place of change, but it's hard to see things when you're in the middle of it, right? It's hard to see the forest for the trees. That's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, definitely. And things are changing so quickly, just in comparison to the way that things have transformed before. I mean, talking about agriculture and the printing press, those were, as far as I'm aware, much slower to be adopted and sort of distributed. Whereas now everybody has a smartphone, and it's just that's in like the past, 5 years or something like that, where it's been from the moment that it was created to now this huge, just mass distribution. And now we're all connected in these ways, and there's so much information. And I think in some ways it can help expose people to other religions. I don't know. I think I definitely agree with you that we're in the forest right now. So we really can't see what's going on. We have to walk quite a ways, but I wonder how much technology is going to change things at this fast pace. I mean, does it give us much opportunity to understand fully how things have changed before they change even more?
I mean, I think that's the answer. We don't know. But isn't it exciting to talk about?
It is. It's exciting.
Right.
It's fascinating. It's a little scary.
Yeah, but living is scary. It should be scary. If you're completely comfortable with everything that's happening in your life, you're not doing it right. I mean, we should confront big questions and confront those things that make us fear, right? Otherwise, what is the point? That's why you came to college, right? To ask big questions, to grow and to become a new person, right? To develop yourself.
That is like fantastic. Our inspirational quote of the day. There you go, Dr. King.
Perfect. All right, what else you got?
On that note, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us. I have had a really good time and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you and good luck.